I think I've mentioned before how disappointing it is that very few people seem to think for themselves. And it struck me that maybe I ought to say something about how you do think for yourself and what are the steps to take in order to do that. What marks people out who think for themselves and how they go about doing that very process. Well, it's really quite straightforward. I think the first thing that you need to do in order to think for yourself is to get some facts or some data which you can use as evidence for part of the process. They kind of fit into the bottom of the structure which you're going to build when you start thinking for yourself. You start off with facts, you start off with evidence. You may even go onto the Office of National Statistics or some other sites like that in order to find the data that you need. Once you've actually got your facts and your evidence, then you can start to reason from them as to see where you can go from that. What can you conclude from that? And then once you've done some reasoning, then you can draw your final conclusions to see if what you've been told by other people actually makes sense according to the data that you found yourself. So a 3-step process really. Get the facts, which you use as evidence, apply your reason, and then you simply draw your own conclusions. And because you've gone through that process, then they are your conclusions. They're not other people's conclusions. You're not using the words of others to avoid thinking for yourself. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Take the issue which is probably most uppermost in most people's minds at the moment, and that is deaths from COVID. It's something which has exercised society for well over a year now, and it seems that everyone is very much afraid of dying from COVID. So, how do you avoid, though, becoming overwhelmed by the kind of fear that many people seem to have, and to try to get things more in proportion? How do you do that? What's the first step? Well, you might start thinking along these lines. You might ask yourself, how many people actually die in a whole year? In this country, that's not hard to find. There's about 600,000 people die from all causes every year in this country. That's kind of the standard death rate. 600,000. What's that per day, would you say? Well, it's not easy to, not so easy to miss that out. It's quite simple to find that one out. You simply take 600,000 and you divide it by 365. The answer you get from that is around about 1,600 people die every day from all kinds of causes. And 1,600 people is quite a lot of people. You can then ask yourself, well, what do they mostly die of in that case? Well, I'm told approximately 1/3 of people die from heart failure of different kinds. Another third die from cancer of different kinds too. And so that means about 500 or 600 people die every day from heart failure. Another 500 or 600 die every day from cancer. How many people die from COVID? Well, we've had some good news recently, and the news is that the number of people who are dying from COVID have dropped dramatically. They've dropped from many figures down to, well, 1 or 2 or even 0 on some days. The number of people dying from COVID these days is 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 out of every single day, 1,600 people dying. What kind of a percentage is that? Well, it's about, I would say, 0.1%, 1 in 1,000 of people who die, approximately, are dying out of COVID. And therefore you have to having put that in context, you realise that, gosh, you're far more likely to die of something else. In fact, you're far more likely to die in a car accident. In fact, I think it's not too far from the figures of the domestic accidents of people who fall down stairs. That's kind of the context in which we're in here. Number of people who die of COVID is much the same as a very low and unlikely death from causes within your own home. That's the first thing you can start thinking about. What's the second thing you can start thinking about? Well, you might say, well, are all the deaths which are recorded from COVID actually due to COVID? All the ones that we've listed, are they COVID deaths? Well, actually, they're not, because what the BBC tells you is that whenever they give you the figures, which seems to be every single day, that these are the people who died from any cause, all causes, but who tested positive with COVID within 28 days. Now, that's quite an interesting figure, because what that means is if you've died from anything at all, but tested positive within 28 days, even if that didn't kill you, then it's still marked down as a COVID death. What that means, of course, is that the figures that we have must be, by very reasoning, inflated. There must be more. There must be many people, for example, who die of maybe heart failure, who were quite asymptomatic, didn't have any symptoms about COVID, but they did test positive within 28 days. All those people would be included. People who died of other causes would have also been included if they tested positive, even if they had no symptoms whatsoever. In fact, we're told by the government that about 30%, maybe more, of people don't have any symptoms whatsoever, even though they test positive for COVID. So now we know that the figures for the people who die from COVID are actually inflated by a fair amount, by at least, well, could be possibly up to 30% or more. So bear that in mind. That's your second fact. And you can draw another conclusion from that, is that the headline figures of the people who die from COVID, well, they're not as accurate as they should be. But we do know that they are less than that, and maybe possibly substantially less than that. Are there any other figures that we can draw on? Any other evidence that we can pull on? Well, yes, I suppose there's something else too. You might also bear in mind that the tests which are being used in order to determine whether people are COVID positive or not have a range of inaccuracies built into them. They're called false positives, maybe false negatives too. The false positives, if you go onto the ONS site, that's the Office of National Statistics, they will tell you that the number of false positives for a PCR test is between 0.8 and 4.3%. That's actually quite large when you think of it. Up to 4.8%, 4.3%, that's nearly 5%. So what we're saying here is that, for example, a million people, take a million people who have tested positive for COVID using a PCR test. Well, 5% of them could well be false positives, or they would be false positives, which means that let's say it was 1% for the moment, and 1% of a million is what? Well, it's about 10,000. So anywhere between, say, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 people who test positive out of every million who test positive, who take the test, they're false positives. And if you've got a very low number of positives indicated in society at any particular one time, and you're still testing large numbers, then a lot of those are going to be false anyway. So not only have you got the number of deaths from COVID being overcounted, you've also got a whole pile of false positives thrown in there. So the number of deaths from COVID is even less than that. And so when you look at how many people die from COVID in a year, or at least within 28 days, the numbers are actually even smaller than what the headline figures are. And when you work that out for yourself and you come to your own conclusions, you start to think to yourself, well, get this in proportion. Having looked at the figures, having looked at the evidence, having done the reasoning, what's my conclusion? My conclusion is that I'm far more likely to die of something else. I'm far more likely to die of a heart attack or from cancer than I am from COVID, by a long margin. And that many of the numbers which are given to us are inflated and exaggerated and packed out by false positives. So no longer, once you start thinking like that, no longer do you have to start simply saying the words of others. repeating the headlines of the mass media, trumpeting the views of experts at the government who will tell you what to think. No, rather, you're now in a position to be able to think for yourself. It's quite straightforward. Pretty well anyone can do it. Just find the evidence that you need. Reason from the evidence and then draw your own conclusions. And what's more, have the confidence of making your own thoughts count. Don't rely on other people to do your thinking for you. You don't need to do that. You're a thinking, rational human being. You can think for yourself. You should think for yourself. And if you do that, you won't be half so scared by statistics or by propaganda or by what the mass media has to say or even what the government tells you, because you've thought it out for yourself.